Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided the property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country. There he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country. He began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed his pigs. He longed for the pods that filled the pigs' stomachs. No one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was there, a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' They began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and the father has killed the fattened calf for him because he is back safe and sound.' The older brother was angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered to his father's orders, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you've never gave me a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours.'"
Clark and Bailey both a hand. Bailey texted me yesterday and had no voice, and then miraculously today she has a voice. So we're thankful, very thankful for that, and also thankful for Clark. So as we get started today, I'm going to do something that we've never done before, at least to my knowledge. We're going to play a quick game, and it's a word association game, and the way this works is really simple. I'm going to name a person, a place, or a thing, and somewhere on your bulletin or on your phone or maybe just in the back of your mind, I want you to write down the first word that comes into your mind whenever you hear whatever it is that I'm going to name. Now, normally, if you're doing this, the correct way, we would all say it out loud, but since we're in public and they're live streaming this, we're not going to do that. So we don't want to embarrass you or the people around you, so just sort of write it down on your own quietly. So here's the first one. Elon Musk. What is the first word that comes in your mind when you hear his name? Maybe for some of you it might be Tesla, maybe it's Twitter, it could be any number of things. Let's try another name. Betty White. Now, if you're older, you might remember her primarily as a movie star. If you're a little younger, she was kind of the sweet old lady that became sort of this cultural icon. How about Steve Jobs? Now, you may not immediately know who that is, but if you have a smartphone in your pocket, specifically an iPhone, then you're part of his legacy, whether you realize it or not. How about this one? How about John Calipari? We'll move on. Let's do one we can all agree on. How about Hardin Phillips? If you don't know Hardin, he'll be in the lobby after service. You can draw your own conclusions. What about this? What about the name Lake Cumberland? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? For some of you, it might be the word family, because that's where everybody gathers. For others of you, it might be money, because you're the one footing the bill when everybody gathers. Maybe it's fun or relaxation or water. It could be anything. Let's try another place. What is the first word that comes into your mind when you hear the word church? Now, depending on your experience, as soon as you hear the word, your mind might be flooded with all these good memories. Or maybe for you, even the word itself brings back reminders of some painful season. We'll come back to that in a couple weeks. For now, though, there's one more name that I want you to respond to, and it's the name God. What is the first word that comes into your mind when you hear the name God? So back in June of 2022, the Gallup organization released startling new research that showed that Americans' belief in God has now reached an all-time low of just 81%. That's down from 87% in 2017. You can sort of see the progression from 1944 until 1965. That number stayed a consistent 98%, meaning that 98% of Americans said they believed in some form of God, and then slowly that number has started to dip, and now it's pretty much in free fall. But what's so troubling about that number is not just the number of people who claim to believe in God or not believe in God. It's what people actually believe about God that's so scary. Researchers from Baylor University wanted to know more about that, and they did some follow-up research, and they discovered that most people's conception of God falls into one of four broad categories, or what they call four buckets. So the first bucket is what they call the authoritative God. So there's a lot of people that go through life and they view God as if he's this angry judge sitting up there in the courtroom of heaven who just can't wait for the next opportunity to administer justice on some guilty convict. Another bucket is what they called the benevolent God, which we see that in our culture. Then there was a third bucket they called the critical God. Some of you can relate to that because some of you grew up with this image of God in which he was always frustrated with you. He was always disappointed in your performance. And to make it even worse, he was keeping this very detailed log of all your missteps so that one day he could remind you of them. And then lastly, there was a bucket they called the distant God. So a lot of people go through life as if God may be out there somewhere, but if he is, we don't know how to get to him, and even though he might be there, he's not all that interested in the details of our day-to-day lives. He sort of keeps his distance. So with that in mind, let me ask you again, what is the first word that comes into your mind when you hear the name God? For some of you, it might be the word hidden. For others, it might be the word disappointed or angry, distant, unresponsive, judgmental, unreasonable, or maybe even unknowable. I don't know what the word is for you, but I do know in order for your life, especially specifically your spiritual life, to get to where it needs to be, that needs to be an accurate description of who God is and what God is like. The great writer A.W. Tozer said it this way. He said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. So of everything that makes you you, Tozer says the most important thing about you is not your IQ, it's not your net worth, it's not your job title, it's what comes into your mind whenever you think about God. And then he goes on to explain why that's true when he wrote these words. For this reason, the gravest question before the church is always God himself. And the most pretentious fact about any man is not what he at any given time may say or do, but what he in his deep heart conceives God to be like. We tend by a secret law of the soul to move toward our mental image of God. This is true not only of the individual Christian, but the company of Christians that composes the church. Always the most revealing thing about the church is her idea of God. Now, if you have your Bible or your phone, I hope you're open to Luke 15, the passage that Clark read for us. Today we're in week 2 of a series that we're calling Prodigals, People, and Parties, and we're spending 4 consecutive weekends looking at this one story. And just to remind you of where we are, at the beginning of Luke 15, Luke tells us there was this huge crowd of people gathered around Jesus to listen to him teach. And almost all of the people in that crowd would fall into one of 2 categories. First, you have what were called the Pharisees, and the teachers of the law on one side, and on the other side, you had the tax collectors and sinners. And one of the Pharisees' ongoing criticisms of Jesus is they could not understand why he always spent time with people who were not like them. They spent their life trying to avoid the tax collectors and sinners, and every time they looked at Jesus, he was surrounded by them, and they didn't know how to process that. So it's upon hearing their specific criticism that Jesus told 3 consecutive stories in Luke 15 that all follow the same pattern and all essentially make the same point. In each of the 3 stories, something of value is missing. So in the first story, it's a lost sheep. In the second story, it's a lost coin. And then in the story that Clark just read for us, it's a lost son. So in each of these stories, you have something of value that's missing. The people involved in the search, once they identify what it is that's missing, they start searching for that thing until they find it. And then whenever they find it, they always end with a huge party. So last weekend, we looked at the experience of the younger son and how after he asked for his inheritance, he went off to a far country. He ran through all the money, and he eventually found himself in a situation in which he was working as a pig farmer. But just to make sure we don't miss how bad it is, Jesus tells us not only is he working as a pig farmer, he's literally eating with the pigs, which is about as low as you could go, especially for a Jew. And then you get to verse 17, and Jesus tells us that he came to his senses. And in that moment, he devised a plan in which he was going to return home to his father and try to repair this relationship that he had broken. So I want you to listen to how Jesus describes this part of the story, starting in verse 17. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father." Now, last weekend, I told you, if you grew up going to church, this is a story that you've probably heard called the parable of the prodigal son. And most of the time, whenever we use the word prodigal, we use it to describe somebody who walked away from God or walked away from the faith and does their own thing like the younger son does in the story. And to be honest, if you're like me, most of the time when you read this story, that's where the emphasis lands because that's the part of the story that's easiest for us to relate to. I mean, we've all done the same thing. We've all gone our own direction. We've all done our own thing. We've all walked away from a relationship with God at some point. And so whenever we read this, it's easy for us to identify with this. I mean, we know what Jesus is saying when he talks about wild living or reckless living. And so that's where we tend to focus. But it's important to understand the word prodigal really doesn't have anything to do with that. In fact, if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll discover the word prodigal has 2 contrasting definitions that are both seen in this passage. So one way to use the word is a prodigal is somebody who has spent everything, which is what happened to the younger son. He took his inheritance, he goes off to the far country, he blows through all the money, and he winds up completely broke. The other way to use the word is it's something that's recklessly extravagant. And it carries with it the idea of somebody who has something and then they give that thing away on this lavish scale. And that's what you see when you take your eyes off the youngest son in this story. That's easy to relate to, admittedly, for most of us. You take your eyes off of him and you put your eyes on the father. Now, just for a moment, I want you to try and put yourself in the father's shoes. What would you do if one of your children came to you and essentially said, "Hey, I'm tired of waiting for you to die. I want my part of the inheritance." And then when you gave it to them, they took off and they went and they blew through it all, living a lifestyle that they knew that you disagreed with. And then when they came to the end of it, they were completely broke. They wanted to come back home. How would you respond? Or maybe a different question might be, how did you respond? Because some of you have been in that situation. Some of you know what it's like to have somebody that you love go off and live a life that you disagreed with and get themselves in just incredibly deep trouble and then try to come back. And the question is, how did you respond? Did you blow your top? Did you lose your cool? Did you tell him to, get lost and never come back? When you get to the end of verse 20, you see the response of this father to the return of his youngest son. And as you read about this dramatic encounter, it quickly becomes evident that the youngest son and the father are operating under two completely different plans. Two competing plans. If you want to understand the younger son's plan, you have to go back to verse 18 where he says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So if you had to choose one word to describe the youngest son's plan, you could choose the word restitution. His plan is to return home, admit his guilt, and then hopefully begin the process of trying to pay back what he squandered. So make sure you understand, he's not asking to be restored to his position as a son. He's just looking for a job. He's just looking for a way to make ends meet. That's why he says, I want to be one of your hired servants. And the phrase in Greek indicates a person who was a tradesman or a craftsman of some sort. And so essentially what this youngest son is asking, he's proposing that he will come back home. He'll come back to the community. His dad will employ him as an apprentice to somebody that works for the estate. And then over time, he can hopefully learn a skill and begin to pay back his debts. To put it in modern terms, he knows he's not going to be the vice president of anything. He just wants to be an intern in the mailroom and start making restitution. Now, if you were here last weekend, I told you Charles Dickens, a great writer, once said that this was the finest short story that was ever written. And one of the things that makes a story a great story is when it includes these plot twists that nobody could have predicted. So in this story in particular is filled with them. The first plot twist is when the younger son goes to his father and he says, I want you to give me my inheritance even though you're not dead. And as soon as he said that, everybody would have almost fell over because that was just not something that would have registered with most people in the first century. But the second plot twist, and maybe even the more surprising plot twist, and the one that must have just almost blown their minds, is the response of this father to his son. Check it out in the second part of verse 20. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Now, had you been standing in the crowd that day, you would have seen the confusion etched across the faces of the religious leaders as what Jesus had just said slowly sank in. And as it began to sink in, you would have felt their anger reach a boiling point because they lived in a world defined by justice in which people got what they deserved. They lived in a world in which sinners were to be avoided, not accepted. And so they had no category in which to place this scene that Jesus had just described. It went against everything they thought they knew about God and what God is like. And in Jesus telling this story, it's clear that the father in the story, who, keep in mind, represents God, is operating under a different plan. Rather than expecting his lost son to pay back restitution, he's focused on restoration. And those are two different things. The father doesn't want a new employee. He wants his son back. He's not worried about rebuilding his bank account. He wants a restored relationship with his son. And so what Jesus is doing here, as he describes the return of this lost son, is he's painting us a picture of what restoration looks like. And as you look at the way Jesus describes it, there are three parts to this process. First is the step of forgiveness. So one of the things I hope you're picking up on as we work our way through this is that Jesus was a master storyteller. And as such, whenever he tells a story, he often includes these details that are really incredible, but are easy to miss unless you're paying close attention. And one of those details is found here in verse 20, where it says that when he saw his son, instead of waiting for his son to get to him, the father in the story does something that no adult man in the first century Jewish culture would ever do, and that's that he got up from where he was and he ran to his son. Now, you have to understand, in that culture, adult men did not run. Children ran, women sometimes run, younger men sometimes ran, but the owner of the estate, the paterfamilias, they did not run anywhere because it was considered undignified. But as soon as this man saw his long-lost son, he couldn't help but run towards him. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Can you imagine what that moment must have felt like? One of the questions that's never answered in this story is how long the youngest son was gone. Was it a few weeks? Was it a few months? Was it an absence that extended to a few years? But however long it was, we know it must have felt longer to the dad. And I know they didn't have like social media, so it's not like he could, get on Instagram and scroll through and have his heart freshly broken with each new post. But I'm sure the stories got back to him. Every time he went into town, somebody said something. Hey, did you hear about your son? Hey, I saw your son. Wasn't in very good shape. And every time somebody asked the question, every time he heard a new story, that wound was reopened. So the way I envision this going down, every afternoon and into the early evenings after the work is all done, this father slowly makes his way to the front porch where he spends hours lost in his thoughts, remembering what it was like when everybody was home and everybody was happy. But then eventually that smile disappeared and the sadness would creep back in as he felt the weight of that broken relationship. And then one evening at the most unexpected time, he looks down that long driveway, and near the end of it, he sees a figure that he vaguely recognizes slowly walking towards. I always wonder if he recognized his walk before he recognized him. It only makes sense. He'd been there for his first step. So it only makes sense that he would recognize the walk of his son. And as it slowly dawned on him who it was that was coming towards him, he got up as quickly as he could. He pulled up his robe and he ran to him. The question is, why did he run? And I think he ran because he wanted to make sure that he got to him before anybody else did. Last weekend, if you were here, we talked about this Jewish ceremony, the Kazeza ceremony. The way it worked, the leaders of the village would gather around this person, this disgraced person who was coming home. They'd have this huge clay pot filled with burnt beans, and the leader of the group would smash that pot, and the smell would escape. And it's supposed to be the smell of shame, and then the pieces of that pot represented the broken relationship that now existed between that person and the community and their family and God. I think the father, in the back of his mind, he wanted to get to this son because he knew there would be some people in that little community who couldn't wait to get to his son and smash that pot and release that smell and send him away. And so rather than taking a chance that one of them will get to him before he does, he pulls up his robe and he runs to his son. And when he gets there, he doesn't break any pots. He doesn't explode. He doesn't lose his cool. Instead, he wraps his arms around him and he kisses him. And the way it's written in Greek, it's an ongoing thing. So he doesn't just kiss him one time. He kisses him, and then he kisses him again. And then he keeps on kissing him as a symbol of his love and his forgiveness. And then as great as that is, there's a second part of this that makes it even better, and that's transformation. It starts with forgiveness, but it continues with transformation. Because when you get to verse 21, this father, he's busy, he's hugging and kissing on his son who's come home, and the son attempts to deliver this speech that he's been working in preparation for this moment. But what I love about this is rather than allowing him to finish his prepared remarks, the father interrupts him and he immediately starts transforming his son's situation. Check this out in verse 21. The son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they begin to celebrate. Now you might read this, and you might think this is primarily what he's trying to clean up his son to make him more presentable, but the reality is the father is performing these carefully chosen actions that would be a symbol to everybody around him that not only was his son being brought back into the family, his son was being restored. So for example, first he orders his servants to bring the best robe, which is the owner of the estate would have been his robe. And then he says, I want you to put a ring on his finger, but it's not just any ring. It's a ring that signified the authority of the father. And it was a clear signal to everybody that was watching that his son was now a full-fledged member of the family. And he says, I want you to bring sandals and put them on his feet. And again, that doesn't mean anything to us, but in that culture, the only people that wore sandals were members of the community. Slaves always went barefoot. Then finally he says, I want you to kill the fattened calf, which was the symbol of a party, because most people in the first century did not eat meat except on special occasions. And he's going to celebrate the restoration of his son. And that's always the last part of this process. There's always a huge celebration. Whenever somebody's forgiven and then they're transformed, you have to celebrate that. We'll talk more about that in a couple weeks. But for today, here's what I think this father's doing. Whenever the leaders of the Kazeza ceremony, the village leaders, whenever they perform this and they smashed one of these clay pots, not only did the broken pots represent the broken relationship between that person and their community, they also represented the brokenness of that person's life. So don't get nervous. I know some of you are really scared because of the last one. I'm not going to break anything because it's already broken. But if you were to do this, if you were to see one of these pots, and it would look something like this, the one way to think about this is that each piece of this broken pot represented a different area of brokenness in that person's life. So that there might be one that says addiction. And there might be another that says unhealthy relationships. Might be another one that says lost wealth. And for this guy in the story, that was a big part of his brokenness. And then over here might be regrets. I mean, it could be any number of things. And some of you can identify with that because if you were to tell your story about the brokenness that's been a part of your life, if you were to label the pieces, it might not look all that different from the story of the prodigal son. As I said, he's the one that's easy for us to relate to because we've all been there to one degree or another. So you might have one that says toxic relationships, and you might have one that says addictions, and you might have one that says missed opportunities or broken wealth or broken families or broken promises. I mean, it could be any number of things that make up the brokenness of your life. And so your life might not look all that different from a broken pot laying on the ground. That's where the younger son was in this story. That's what his life looked like. That's what everybody else around him, that's what they saw when they looked at him. And somebody said, some of you can relate to that because you've got some brokenness in your life. You look at where you are now and you are nowhere close to where you thought you'd be. Or maybe you're not even who you thought you would be. And maybe for you, every time you start to think about how would I put these pieces back together, it's hard to imagine because it feels like an impossible task. And one of the things I love about this story that's so important that, again, is easy to skip over is that the youngest son, he knew he couldn't transform his own situation. He came to this moment of realization, this moment of clarity, where he knew the only hope of ever taking the brokenness that was his life and putting it back together was not going to be done in his own power. For that to happen, he had to return to his father. And so when he finally did, rather than piling on and rather than pushing him away, his father begins the process of inviting him in and then taking all of these broken pieces that have made up his life. And over time, he begins to put those pieces back together in a way that this youngest son of his could have never done on his own. When you get to 2 Corinthians 4, the Apostle Paul says this beautifully when he says, "But we have this treasure," talking about the gospel, "in jars of clay," talking about us. So there's broken pieces, there's cracks, there's things that aren't all that pretty, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to demonstrate, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. So if you don't hear anything else, here's what I want you to know today. You need to know that you are completely incapable of solving your own problem. Say it again. You are completely incapable of solving your own problem. You cannot take, no matter how hard you try, you cannot take the broken pieces of your life and put them back together in your own strength. Because if you could, you already would have. Because you've been trying for a really long time. Let me think back over the last few years of your life, and you've spent a lot of time trying to take this and do this, only to discover that you can't. That's the bad news. The good news is that you have a Father who's more than capable of taking this and turning it into this, taking all those broken pieces, the regrets, the bad decisions, the unhealthy relationships, the addictions, the dysfunctional family, whatever it is, he can take all of that and somehow, in ways that we can't even understand and can't fully comprehend, putting all of that back together in a way that honors him. And maybe the best news of all is that not only is he capable of it, he actually wants to do it. One of my favorite parts of this story that I skipped over intentionally as we read through this is found at the end of verse 20. It says, "While he was still a long way off, his father saw him." How do you see something that's off in the distance? I mean, when something's right in your face, it's hard to miss, but how do you see something that's off in the distance? You only see it if you're looking for it. You only see it if you're watching for it. And so when Jesus wanted to paint a more accurate picture of who God is and what God is truly like, he painted him not as an angry judge, not as a distant king, but rather as a father who is always watching and waiting for his children to come home. That's why Tozer said, whatever comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. A big problem that some of us have, though, is that whenever we think about God, whatever comes into our mind first is not accurate. And sometimes it's not even all that positive. Because some of us are angry, disappointed, frustrated with ourselves and with our circumstances. We assume that God must be angry and disappointed and frustrated with us. But here's something I want you to understand. How you feel about God has no bearing on how God feels about you. You can be angry with him. You can be frustrated with him. You can try to be distant from him, and that has no bearing on how he feels about you. Because when you think about God, the first thing that should come into your mind is that you have a Father who is waiting and watching for you. I want you to stand with me. In just a second, Bailey and the team are going to come. And they're going to lead us in a song that talks about the love of God and how he pursues us even when we go a different direction. And even when we try to run away from him, he runs after us. And make sure you understand, as great as this story is, this is not a story about a young man who goes off to a far country, blows his life up, and then eventually tries to come back home, even though that's the story that we like to tell. Instead, this is a story about a prodigal father who was recklessly extravagant when it comes to pouring out his love on his children, even, and maybe especially even when they don't deserve it. So if there's anything this story tells us, is no matter how far you've drifted or how long you've been gone, if you take, just the slightest step in God's direction, He runs towards you to bring you home. So if you want to talk with somebody about that, if you have questions about what that would look like for you, if you just want to pray with somebody, David will be here, I'll be here. We'd love to talk with you. You just come meet us on this front row, and we'll be glad to help you in any way we can.